Welcome to one more edition of Politics Done Right. Once again, we are here with Andy Schmookler. And listen, Andy has a series with us, and we're going to be talking a hell of a lot about this particular subject. A better human story is what I like to call it, because that's what he calls it. Anyhow, let's get busy. Andrew, today we're going to talk about one of your other posts, or I should say two, the central challenge facing any civilization, creating species. And the other one will be keeping the central challenge always before our eyes. And I read those two articles and I have quite a bit of questions, but what I'm going to do is first of all ask you, why did you come out with a piece titled The Challenge Facing Any Civilization hyphen Creating Species? What do you mean by that?
Well, you and I had a conversation last time out about the problem that civilization brings about. That's not a function of the nature of the creature. It's a function of the disorder that inevitably accompanies a creature doing what I describe civilization as extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically by inventing its own way of life. In the 3.5 billion years that life evolved on this planet, there had never been anything like that. Never a life form that was essentially shaped by the creative intelligence of a creature. And unwittingly, that creates an anarchic situation. The anarchic situation generates a war of all against all. The war of all against all creates a selective process because only certain non-randomly selected cultural options will prevail in that war. And the result is that the ways of power inevitably will shape how the civilization evolves, regardless of the nature of the creature who has taken that bold step into inventing its way of life. We talked about that before. I'm willing to leave that as the placeholder and go on, or well, if there's something there.
Yeah, where I want to go is that in the first part here, you talk about civilization creating two dangerous kinds of disorder.
Yes, well, the two kinds, one of them is the war of all against all. And that means that inevitably these civilizing societies are going to have to interact with each other outside of any order. So that's the war of all against all. And when you think, and we're going to have to probably come back to this, that as the civilization develops, the creature is going to get ever greater powers, which we saw well, just before my lifetime began. We've got now the power to destroy the planet with a nuclear holocaust, certainly destroy our civilization. But if we went all out, so that's one kind of disorder, the disorder of war with the creature who over time will develop more and more destructive potential with the weapons it develops. The other kind of disorder is implied by extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. So when we've got a primate group that evolves into hunting, gathering, cultural human beings who are still living more or less like primate societies in their small bands. And then 10 or 12,000 years ago, they start growing crops of the foods that they used to gather and herding animals that they used to hunt. That's inventing their own way of life. And that means breaking out of the order, that the ecological order, which they had lived in that niche. I don't know if we need to go into all the ways in which the evolutionary process doesn't just fashion our bodies, it fashions the relationships of the whole living system. The way I've put it is the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other.
Now,
So that's, and we've seen now with climate change, how the increasing powers of the civilization that we've created really do threaten the survival of human civilization.
And with that, I want to go to point two, because you say it would seem to be more or less inevitable that the destructive powers of any such species civilization will keep growing, and thus in time will reach a level that threatens the survival of civilizations. Before you comment on that, I want to challenge that. Why is it that we inevitably have to reach a point of destructive powers as opposed to the converse?
Well, the powers are not necessarily destructive. I mean, they can be used destructively. The power, but first, why would our powers grow? Well, we're talking about a creature that's inventing its own way of life. It breaks out, and as we break out, like into horticultural societies and then agricultural societies, and then the door seems to be open-ended for all the cultural innovations that are possible. I mean, there's so many things that you can do when you're a hunter-gatherer that you can, but I think, what I want to gather is, because first of all, if we look at humanity as that species that we're talking about, I see that what you're saying is true. My question is, why does it need to be true? In other words, our destructive power for real has increased as we have become more civilized, if you will. Well, but is that necessarily so, or could it have gone the other way, that we became we use the benevolence of our intellect? Well, the first thing is that our powers will increase, and that was what I was trying to explain, which is that the possibilities of innovation are open-ended. The door has been open for all kinds of things, like just looking around ourselves, after 10,000 years, what we've got. But the other piece of it is that that we are cultural animals, and no creature is going to create civilization without being a cultural animal. That means we've got the capacity to have cumulative cultural change. To be cultural animals means to be able to pass along from generation to generation, whatever it is that each generation has come up with. So there's going to be a cumulative thing, and the powers of the species are going to necessarily increase. It can also be declines, like when Rome fell. Rome was the greatest power of its era, but it fell apart for reasons we don't have to go into, and say European civilization lapsed into what they now call the Dark Ages. So you can have a decline in a civilizational system of powers, but eventually Europe came back together. Europe developed new ways of finding out, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution. The powers keep growing. So it may take, it took us about, let's see, it was in the 20th century that we developed the ability to destroy ourselves. And so let's say that took 10 or 12,000 years. If some other creature it developed civilization on some other planet, maybe they would come to that point later, or maybe they would come to that point sooner. But eventually, since we have the ability to keep innovating, since we're going to keep on developing greater power to achieve whatever our purposes are, we will develop powers that are great enough that if they are used destructively, they can bring down the house on our roofs. And that first point about the implications of civilization, which is namely that we unleash inevitably a force of brokenness, that our civilization will inevitably give the spirit of the gangster a disproportionate say on how our societies will develop. That force of brokenness is an inevitable byproduct of civilization. And so there is the challenge that we come to. as our powers grow, as the force of brokenness that inevitably emerges with civilization keeps on reverberating through the centuries, and we can talk about that, if not in this conversation, then I hope in a future one, how the force of brokenness transmits its various patterns of brokenness by breaking people and breaking social organizations and breaking the international system to keep generating brokenness. Eventually, we're going to come to the point where we either will order our civilization well enough and soon enough to prevent our destroying ourselves, or that force of brokenness will end in the self-destruction of the civilization. And I think it's a toss-up right now, which way it's going to go for the human species on this planet.
Well, I mean, as it turns out right now, I mean, and I'm still trying to get this from you, and that is, I mean, you know, I'm saying that the conclusions that we have, we're living it, right? We're living a lot of what you're saying. I mean, we're living that as we've become more powerful, we've become more self-destructive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you brought in an interesting topic when you talk about not the charlatan, what you call it, the that person who does the strong man, what did you call it?
The gangster or the
warlord? Gangster,
yeah.
right?
Right.
So it seems to me, and tell me if this is the way you meant it or not. As we become more powerful, as humanity becomes more powerful, civilization become more powerful, we are able to more destroy ourselves. In other words, you know, we can reach to that point. But reaching to that point could just as well be, instead of destroying ourselves, we could ascend and make ourselves a lot better, right?
Well, we've been doing both of them right along.
Right.
We have, you know, you and I are at an age that, well, I especially, you know, our life expectancy around the planet. I think, you know, the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, the life expectancy of an American was something like 40 years.
It was very, yeah.
Yeah, and now it's getting close to 80. You know, we have public health measures have increased them. We're able to feed people better. You know, our powers I say that there are two coherent forces at work in the world. One that spreads a pattern of wholeness that makes things better. I mean, I've been writing just lately about how long it took us before anybody really could create a democratic society. So, you know, that was an achievement that they, you know, the miracle in Philadelphia in 1787, for all its flaws. And I'm sure you're quite aware of the flaws.
Oh,
I am too.
Absolutely. Well,
yeah.
I mean, the reason I'm glad that you got there because, and again, I'm glad that you brought also in the gangster, because my contention is, as I understand what you're saying, is that maybe, just maybe, as we become more powerful and as we are improving ourselves, if you will, that it's that gangster that runs the risk of bending that curve, right?
Well, the force of brokenness is manyfold. I mean, we can look at the gangster element like, you know, in recent months, some of us have worried this guy, Putin,
right,
who's made this terrible blunder and who seems to be incapable of recognizing that it's a blunder and accepting it's a blunder, and who commands a vast nuclear arsenal. You know, that he has the capacity to pull the plug on the whole thing.
right.
That is assuming that people would follow his orders, which maybe they would and maybe they wouldn't. So there's the gangster element, but there's also around us, and this is why when I talk about, I have a way of understanding the battle between good and evil.
Right.
You know, the evil, I define evil as a coherent force that consistently spreads a pattern of brokenness. And so we can take a look at, let's say, what are the forces that today's Republican Party is harnessing? because the Republican Party is sort of a pure case that I don't think I've ever seen in a democratic society. But there's white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
There's the greed of the plutocrats.
Mm-hmm.
Back when W was president, there was the imperialistic element of the American civilization, the element that made treaties with the Native Americans and then broke them, that concocted ideas like manifest destiny. And all these currents are, when you talk about the spirit of the gangster, I'm talking about not only that the warlord wins in the war of all against all, but he shapes societies that are, first of all, the war of all against all is traumatic for people to live through. I mean, what the Ukrainians are living through now, who knows how that's going to ramify? I have ancestors that left Ukraine over 100 years ago because they were fleeing pogroms. And there are stories passed down in my family of that experience. And my brother and I have talked, for example, about the epigenetic phenomenon. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I'm not.
But Lamarck had a theory of evolution where people's experiences change their genes.
Okay, gotcha.
But they don't experience, the experiences don't change people's genes, but they can change how they get expressed. So that what my grandparents went through can affect the way my brother and I develop through the epigenetic process. But in any event, people who are ground up in the war of all against all, they end up being broken in some ways. Also, the societies that get shaped by the dictates of the warlords who enslave the many, generating the empires and the tyrannies of the ancient world, they generate cultures through the reign of power that require people to internalize the demands of their society. This is what we require of you. And what we require of you is what will maximize our power. And what will maximize our power can be very much at odds with what will fulfill the inborn needs of the human creature. So when we talk about the force of brokenness, we're not just talking about the gangsters like Putin and what he does and what the empires of the Middle East did 5,000 years ago. We're also talking about the brokenness of people who have a need to assert themselves in ways that are growing out of trauma. White supremacy is not an inborn need of a human being. But if you put people through a certain kind of injurious process, they will develop a need to hold other people down. There's a saying, when you study the history of racism in America, well, I may not be much, but I'm better than them.
Right, I know exactly what that is. In fact, that is what allowed slavery to continue when blacks and whites were actually united to actually take over our feudal system.
And then in Jim Crow, the rich whites say, we're together, they exploit and manipulate and deceive. And people who are treated like crap have a need to think, I'm something. But if you're living in a society that treats you like nothing, the way you'll express that need to be something will perpetuate the patterns of brokenness.
Exactly. I wish more people understood that concept. That is very important. Now, you says whether human civilization will succeed or fail in meeting that challenge and survive for the long haul is in doubt. And there are many times that in as much as we have all these nuclear weapons just ready to blow, I've always thought that just maybe we would never get there. But I think Putin did something to the psyche of a lot of people And I think it showed us that there is, in fact, that possibility that we can actually go too far and be on the brink. Your thoughts?
Well, I was a senior in high school when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. And I remember, I don't know that I've mentioned this before. I remember sitting in the stands at a football game in October of 1962 and looking out in the direction of Minneapolis, which I thought was not the first choice of where the Soviet Union would attack, but
right.
There are a lot of, it's Minneapolis Honeywell and various other high tech. It was a target fairly high up, and I was thinking, while I'm looking, will that flash occur? So for me, Putin is just a reminder of something that was instilled in me. Oh, and my generation, as everybody gets to hear who follows, in the 1950s, you see the video of these kids doing their duck and cover. We don't want these kids to be to get the windows, the flying shards
Debris,
of glass. So we would duck and cover, or we would go out into the hall and huddle down by our lockers. So the idea that it might happen for my generation was out there.
Well, thrive and die.
Thrive and die, or thrive or die
appear to be the options as the growth of civilizations powers lead to the disappearance of the middle, muddling through option. That sounds like something some of my people on my show would say when we're talking about the middle and where the middle is, etc.
Well, by middle, I think, it's frustrating to me how little people think about the sweep of history and the challenges we face in terms of the future. I mean, for some people, the future means, the next paycheck, or a corporation, it's the next quarterly report, but we're really involved in a long game. So people will think, yeah, we got dangers, but we'll muddle through. After all, we've always muddled through. I mean, this civilization game's been going on for, like that kid who said in the letter to God, my grandfather says you were around when he was a kid. Just how far back do you go? But, but the thing is, we've reached the point in the last 100 years where our capacity for self-destruction has grown considerably.
Right.
And what we're doing now is we're playing Russian roulette. Figuratively speaking, I'm not talking about Putin.
I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're taking chances.
So how many times can we have a Cuban Missile Crisis and come out the other side okay? Like Kennedy and Khrushchev worked it out. In that movie 13 Days, you get to see how they did it, or at least a version of how they did it.
Right.
I wrote a piece months before the Ukraine thing, because I'm worried about the United States and China. China is also a nuclear power,
right.
and they are a power that's expanding. And history shows that when there's an established power and then there's an up and coming power, that can be a very dangerous time for the world. The most famous example of that is that the Great Britain, Britannia rules the waves. The sun never sets on the British Empire.
On the British Empire.
And here's Germany emerging in the late 19th century as a very dynamic, powerful industrial nation. And they don't have an empire, and they've got a desire to be the big boy on the block. So that was so China and the United States are sort of parallel right now, though the Ukraine thing has distracted us from that, but the Chinese keep reminding us with their warnings about Taiwan. China and the United States are like Germany and Great Britain, so it's a dangerous time. So I wrote a piece about we can't keep playing Russian roulette. When I talk about ordering our civilization well enough and soon enough to prevent our destroying ourselves, what I mean is we can't keep on, if you're playing Russian roulette, if you do it indefinitely, the outcome eventually is a sure thing.
Yeah, the laws averages. I mean, stats, right.
What can happen eventually will happen. So we have to create an order in the world where something like the Cuban Missile Crisis cannot happen. It's not obvious how to create that world order or how we, though, I mean, we could imagine it theoretically, but then there's the question, well, how do we get from here to there? And I'm not saying the answers are at all easy, but it's a question we need to face, because the alternative is we're going to keep on spinning the chamber, and one of the times that chamber is going to be the bullet.
Why do you say the options for human species don't include muddle through, don't include our getting by with the combination of glorious and ugly we've enacted over the millennia?
Well, that Russian roulette idea was my attempt to explain why we can't just keep muddling through. We got to create a different kind of order, because if let's say if great powers get into great nuclear powers get into some kind of a showdown situation, let's just say it's every 50 years. Let's see, it was 1962. Well, this is 60 years.
22 now, yeah.
Yeah. So let's say it's every 60 years. How many times can you play that game without getting the chamber with the bullet in it? You can't go on indefinitely. You have to get rid of that possibility before you get to that. Now, we may already have missed the boat. Putin hasn't done it yet, but it's not impossible. And over Taiwan, there might be some miscalculation. So there's no guarantee that we have, that we're not already too late. But one thing I think we can assume is, if we keep on having situations like that, which I think is inevitable in the present global system, it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the muddling through thing, is to think that we can keep on playing Russian roulette indefinitely. We can't.
What do you mean by keeping central challenge always before our eyes?
Well, the question, okay, so I said, I articulated the central challenge with this language. Will our species be able to order our civilization well enough and soon enough to prevent our civilization's destroying itself? And that has to do both with the war to self-destruction and the bringing down the whole biosphere on our heads. So your question to me was, how do we deal with that?
Right.
And the answer that I come up with is, first of all, we have to envision, where do we have to get to? We have to have it in front of our eyes, the way the world is going to have to look for us to be able to, for civilization to be able to make it for the long haul. That's the goal that I'm taking to heart, is that human civilization, that different peoples live in peace with each other and don't destroy the planet, and that human civilization operates in harmony with the needs of the biosphere. So we don't bring down the planet on us like we seem to be doing with climate change. So we need to think about, where do we have to get to where we've got reasonable peace on Earth that's secure, that we're not going to blow ourselves up, and reasonable harmony with the planet, so that we can keep going as a civilization without destroying the underpinnings. I mean, we depend on the biosphere for our survival. And so that's the first step, is to try to envision, what do we have to become? What would the world look like where we don't have these two dangers hanging over our heads? And then the second question we have to ask ourselves is, and with respect to envisioning, that's an ongoing process.
Right. Well,
we don't have
if
to
you're not learning, you're not learning.
Yeah, we don't have to figure it all out now. Just what's our best guess, or even the range of guesses? And then the next question is, what steps can we take now that are wise and prudent and well-designed to get us toward that destination that we have to reach. And that's not the way we think in our civilization. I mean, there are people who do think that way. Sustainable, sustainable economies and systems of collective security and world order. I mean, people have been wrestling with both of these questions for a long time, but they're not foremost. We're focused just on dealing with the immediate problem. And we do have to deal with the immediate problem, but we have to have some attention devoted to the things that we need to deal with, or civilization isn't going to make it.
You know, I want to sort of digress a bit, because a lot of what you have to say, you know, it's sort of a civilization that can do whatever it pleases, but it seems when you speak, you have that bias of the gangster taking things over. I mean, in everything that you're saying, you're talking about what happens when we go off the rails, as if we have to go off the rail, or it's inherent within us that we go off the rails.
Not inherent. And you may remember that when we talked about
let me stop you a second, because you're correct. You never actually said that. In fact, one of the premises of why we wanted to discuss things was that you believe inherently that humanity will survive because we are inherently good. You gave me the impression.
Well, I didn't make a prediction that we would necessarily survive. I'm saying that any creature anywhere that embarks on the path of civilization will face this challenge.
Right.
And because the step onto civilization unleashes a systemic force.
But is it true, sir? Is it true that we are? I want to go to the part that you're saying that we're maybe you didn't say we're inherently good, but you're saying we're not as bad as you think we are.
Yeah, the way I put it was, the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large.
That's the point.
That's the point. And the reason, you know, the history is going to be ugly for any creature of any inherent nature. I mean, we are cultural creatures. That means we are born with the capacity to be shaped to fit the world around us.
Right.
We aren't stamped with an indelible imprint. We have inherent nature, but we can be, if you and I were born in Sparta 2,500 years ago, we would have been socialized to become that kind of a warrior. Mm-hmm. If we were born in the Han Dynasty in China, you and I would have developed that particular kind of mentality. We, as cultural creatures, and then you add that plasticity of a cultural animal to the fact that there's a selective process that says that the societies are going to evolve in a particular direction, that make particular kinds of demands that are a function of the society's need to maximize its power in order to survive the war of all against all. And they're going to find monsters to rule. They're going to find there's a selective process that is going to create societies that make demands hostile to human nature. People are going to conform to the demands of their societies, even though it's going to cause internal psychological injury, that the demands within that the society has imposed are in conflict with the needs within that came from the biological evolutionary process. And between those two, there's a war going on within the civilized human being living in these societies whose shape has been dictated by the war of all against all that has enshrined the gangster as the ruler. So the human nature issue, we can talk about, well, what is our human nature and how are we going to find it? But what I feel like I've proved, and people, I hope they'll be able to see where to see this laid out systematically. What I feel that I've proved is that what we see in history is ugly not because we ourselves are ugly, but because the process that is unleashed with the disorder of civilization will inevitably inflict that ugliness on our history.
Now you're saying then that well, let me back up a bit. Yes, history is ugly, but we also have some beautiful history as well, right?
Oh yeah. I don't mean to. Yeah. I mean, people have always struggled to create meaning and fulfillment and beauty and in difficult situations.
Right.
Even the most dark times, even people in concentration camps or prisons, and even, oppressed peoples living within oppressive societies have created beauty as best they can.
Right.
I mean, the music that has come out of the suffering of Black people is one of the great marvels of American culture. But there are wounds that go with it too. I mean, you don't escape the wounds. But yeah, I don't mean to just to say that the history of our species is a disgraceful one. It's a species that, yeah, go ahead.
I like the direction of this discussion, but we're closing in on time, and the great thing is this is a wonderful series that we're discussing these issues among many others. What I'd like you to do for me, Doctor, is to do two things. First of all, give us a clear opinion to associate what you're saying with what we're seeing in America right now occurring with this the right wing, where it just seems like chaos and destruction.
Well, let's see, that I love that question, and I find it challenging, even though I've been working on it for a long time. What we see on the right is what I call a pure case. I mean, I can't name anything in recent years where the effect of the Republican Party has made things better. And the Republican Party and the Democratic Party that I grew up with, you could find fault with both, and you could find virtues with both, but this is that pure case. But I also think that there's a brokenness that's systemic, that it's not only on the right that the problem arises. That I know we're coming up against time, and I was about to take a turn that I'll just give you an idea of where we.
Yeah, summarize it, because this is something that we can blend into the next conversation as well.
Yeah, I was looking at polarization in the 1990s and doing everything I could to fight it. And then I watched how that polarization developed into, like it was, you can imagine like a force of brokenness that we developed on the right, a force that was good at fighting and was morally bankrupt. And on the left, the liberal America, we developed a force that was fairly consistently leaning in constructive directions, trying to achieve better things, but was completely clueless when it came to the battle for power. And it's a dichotomy, as if there's two photographs. I don't know that negatives exist anymore because we take them digital photos, but in the old days, if you looked at the negative, the people's teeth that were bright
would be dark. Yeah,
we're dark. And the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and more broadly, conservative America and liberal America, became these like polar opposites. And that form of brokenness, when you separate power from goodness, the way the polarization process progressively did through the 1990s, and then with Fox News and Karl Rove and on into Barack Obama's presidency, that kind of force of brokenness split up the strengths that we need to combine. And we could also talk about the brokenness that emerged in the American public, so that we had a large segment of the population that was vulnerable to propaganda coming out of the.
We're gonna discuss that in much more detail as we move along with a better human story, because I think this is prescient. I think this is deep, and I think understanding these not only values and virtues, but quite a bit more, kind of puts us in the right frame of mind to understand what's going on right now. Dr. Andy Schmookler, I can't tell you how happy it is that we've actually connected to work on the series that examines a lot of your thought processes and that you've written about. Until the next time, thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right.
Well, I am very pleased to talk with you every time we talk.
We spend a lot of time deconstructing the news, trying to parse it into a form that everybody can understand. We try to find those little nitpicks where it flies above the fray, etc. If you really like these videos that we do, I want to ask a big favor. Please go ahead, number one, subscribe to our channel, and number two, please join if you can. Thank you so kindly for watching. Keep watching. Please remember to share. We must populate the entire internet with our progressive message, a message that we know is what most Americans say that they want. So help us, please join.